Security's grip tightened around the waitress's arm as the porcelain plates shattered across the marble floor, and in that blinding second of humiliation, the entire restaurant fell silent except for the sound of her breath breaking into pieces. If you believe in hope, compassion, and second chances, viewers of Pure Kindness, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, because some stories remind us why kindness still matters in a world that forgets too easily. It was late morning, sunlight pouring through the tall glass windows of the Laurent Crown, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. The golden light illuminated crystal chandeliers and white linen tables, reflecting softly against polished floors. Outside, traffic moved lazily under a blue sky, unaware that inside, a life was about to collide with its past. The waitress's name was Mirela Kovac. 29 years old, pale skin flushed with shock, blonde hair pinned into a neat bun beneath a navy vest and crisp white shirt. Her apron was slightly wrinkled from the rush of the lunch crowd. Her hands trembled, but not because of the broken plates. It was the way the head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Grant, held her like she was disposable, like a stain to be wiped from the room. Across the dining hall stood Alistair Vance, a 42-year-old billionaire investor with steel-gray eyes and a tailored burgundy suit that fit him like armor. He had built his empire from technology acquisitions and ruthless business instincts. Newspapers called him visionary. Rivals called him merciless. But today, none of that mattered, because when he looked at Mirela's face, something old and buried shifted inside him. Mirela hadn't always been a waitress. 12 years earlier, she had been the daughter of a brilliant but controversial architect, Victor Kovac. Their family had once lived in a modest but loving home. Her father believed in ethical design, in building affordable housing instead of luxury towers. He refused a deal that would have made him wealthy but displaced hundreds of families. That deal had been backed by a young, ambitious investor named Alistair Vance. When Victor refused, funding vanished. Contracts evaporated. Accusations spread. The pressure crushed him slowly. And Mirela, barely 17 at the time, watched her father fade under the weight of public shame he did not deserve. Now, years later, she stood in the restaurant that Alistair partially owned, a place her father would have criticized as excess. The accident with the plates had not been clumsiness. It was the shock of seeing Alistair's face up close for the first time in years. She had recognized him instantly. The same sharp jawline. The same controlled posture. The same man who had once shaken her father's hand and later signed papers that ended everything. Grant tried guiding her toward the exit, his expression cold, eager to remove disruption before it stained the billionaire's lunch meeting. Mirela's chest rose and fell rapidly. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't even speaking. She simply stared at Alistair with a mixture of disbelief and restrained anguish that made him uneasy. Alistair had grown accustomed to power. When people trembled, it was usually out of admiration or fear of his status. But this was different. This was recognition. The midday light intensified, casting a sharp glow across Mirela's face. And in that brightness, he saw it, the faint resemblance. The eyes. Victor's eyes. A memory flickered. A modest office years ago. Papers spread across a table. Victor's voice steady but firm, refusing to compromise his principles. Alistair had been younger then, driven by hunger to prove himself to a world that once told him he was nothing. He had convinced himself that business was war, and casualties were inevitable. But he had never expected to see the aftermath standing in front of him. Mirela felt exposed, like the entire room could see the scars she carried. She had worked 2 jobs to put herself through community college. She had cared for her father until his heart gave out from stress-related complications. She had swallowed resentment because survival required silence. Taking this job at the Laurent Crown had been an irony she forced herself to endure. The tips were good. Rent had to be paid. She hadn't known he was an owner. Alistair lifted his hand slightly, and Grant paused. A subtle gesture, but powerful. The room held its breath. Mireille's knees weakened, not from fear of losing the job, but from the weight of 12 years pressing against her ribs. She remembered hospital corridors, overdue notices, neighbors whispering. She remembered promising herself she would not let bitterness define her. But seeing him cracked something open. Alistair stepped closer, dismissing his business partners with a look. His polished shoes clicked against the marble, each step echoing like a countdown. He examined her name tag as if verifying a suspicion. Kovac. The surname struck harder than any accusation. For the first time in years, Alistair felt something unfamiliar in his chest, not ambition, not calculation, but regret. He had researched companies, markets, competitors. But he had never researched what happened to Victor's family after the deal collapsed. He had assumed they moved on, as everyone does in the stories powerful men tell themselves. Mireille's thoughts spiraled. She imagined being escorted outside, jobless again. She imagined going home to her tiny apartment with cracked walls and telling herself she should have kept her composure. Her life had been a series of swallowing pride to survive. And now survival demanded she stand silently while history stared at her. But Alistair saw more than a waitress. He saw the version of himself he once ignored, the young man who had justified harm as strategy. He saw his own father, a factory worker who had been laid off when a corporation cut costs. He remembered the anger he once carried. Somewhere along the path to billions, he had buried that memory beneath luxury. The sunlight softened, clouds drifting outside as if the sky itself was shifting mood. Grant slowly released Mireille's arm when Alistair's expression changed from irritation to something reflective. The tension in the room loosened slightly, though whispers fluttered across nearby tables. Mireille felt the shift but did not understand it. She expected dismissal. Instead, she saw conflict in Alistair's eyes, a silent reckoning. He realized that the architect who refused him had not been foolish. He had been brave. And this woman standing in a navy vest and apron was not an inconvenience. She was the living consequence of a decision made in pursuit of wealth. Alistair's world was built on acquisitions. Fix problems. Buy them. Control them. But this could not be purchased. Mireille's composure finally cracked. Not into rage, but into exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying a past alone. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, Alistair saw vulnerability instead of defiance. The restaurant manager hovered anxiously, unsure whether to intervene. Customers pretended to resume eating but watched closely. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, life continuing as usual. Inside, something rare was happening, a billionaire confronting his own shadow. Mireille thought of her father's final words, that integrity outlives reputation. She had clung to that belief when everything else collapsed. Alistair felt as if the polished walls around his identity were cracking. He had spent years donating to charities, funding scholarships, convincing himself he was balanced. But he had never faced someone directly harmed by his ambition. He understood then that power without accountability becomes hollow. The turning point was not dramatic. There was no shouting. No spectacle. It was the moment Alistair straightened, not in pride, but in humility. The manager stepped back. Grant lowered his gaze. The business partners shifted uncomfortably. And Mireille, confused and emotionally drained, sensed that something unexpected was unfolding. As the weight of the past hovered between them, viewers, if this story is touching your heart, please support it with a like and share, and let kindness travel further than cruelty ever did. Before the final moment, take a second to comment what you believe matters more, wealth or integrity. The afternoon light brightened again as the clouds parted. It illuminated dust particles in the air, making the entire restaurant feel suspended in time. Mireille felt tears sting her eyes, not from weakness, but from release. She had carried resentment like a hidden stone in her pocket. Confronting its source had felt terrifying. But in this fragile silence, she realized something profound: she had survived. She had built herself without his help. Alistair recognized that redemption does not erase damage. But it can begin with acknowledgement. He saw not a waitress beneath him, but a woman who endured what his ambition had cost her family. The security guard stepped fully aside. Mirella stood freely now. In that sunlit dining hall, amid clinking glasses and whispered tension, two lives intersected, not as powerful and powerless, but as human beings shaped by choices and consequences. The world outside remained noisy and fast. But inside the Loran crown, something quiet and transformative took root. Because sometimes, the most powerful realization is not who someone is, but who we have been to them. And when we dare to face that truth, we discover that true wealth is not measured in billions, but in the courage to make things right and the humility to recognize when we were wrong.